Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and it's so great to spend this time with you. Well, the latest headlines for today are essentially a very big delegation from India is in Canada. We're going to tell you what that means for Canadian businesses as well as the Indian business leaders that are here for the next 2 days. And when it comes to the critical Iran-US essentially conflict that's been going on since February 28th, well, there has been news that the Iranian delegation is in Qatar over this dispute for a peace resolution. We're going to give you all the details of what it means. And when it comes to pipelines and the politics around pipelines in Alberta, we've covered all the latest when it comes to the referendum in Alberta. Well, today you have the Western Premiers meeting, and essentially in the background, there is tension around building out pipelines when it comes to Alberta, British Columbia, and Ottawa. And another big news is for Ontario politics. Caroline Mulroney essentially announced that she's going to make an exit from Ford's cabinet and as an MPP next month. So I'm going to let you know what this means for the PCs and what could be behind her big announcement. So you want to stay with us for all of that and much more. So now starting with this massive trade delegation from India of business leaders who are visiting Canada for today until Wednesday. So that's May 25th to the 27th. This is led by the Indian Minister of Commerce and Industry, Piyush Goyal. He says this is the largest ever trade delegation sent by India to any country, compromising over 150 years of 150 industry leaders and business representatives here in Canada. There you have the Trade Minister, Maninder Sidhu, who's been essentially putting the groundwork for this historic event today. And this comes after India and Canada appear to be accelerating their efforts to repair the damaged diplomatic relationship. If you recall, what took place back then with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. This is coming at a time where you had this massive dispute, diplomatic dispute between the two countries because of this massive fallout. If you recall, the explosive fallout surrounding the allegations tied to the killing of Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar. And now you have this renewed engagement from, Prime Minister Mark Carney and India, essentially now leading to this massive trade delegation that is taking place with meetings in Ottawa and Toronto. Essentially, this is one of the largest, they said, of trade delegates coming to Canada, and they'll focus on trade, investment, technology, energy, manufacturing, and what would be a greater economic cooperation between the two countries. Now, going back to how this all started when it comes to the diplomatic fallout, well, if you recall back in 2023, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau got up in Parliament and essentially made the allegations that Indian agents were linked to the killing of a Sikh activist, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, in British Columbia. And this dispute essentially triggered diplomatic expulsions, intelligence accusations, and travel warnings, and almost a near freeze in political relations. The both countries expelled diplomats, and India accused Canada of tolerating extremism of Khalistani separatist activity. If you recall, this entire thing happened. And then you fast forward to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stepping down, causing a leadership election in the Liberal Party. Carney wins that. Then he heads to a general election last year, becomes, Canada's prime minister, beating the Conservatives who were looking to essentially take over under Pierre Poilievre. And then slowly after that, if you recall, there was the massive fallout taking place with our American counterparts under the Trump administration, essentially saying Canada should be the 51st state, and a lot of pushback. And with this CUSMA review that's around the corner, and then you had Prime Minister Mark Carney essentially starting his journey of going to many different countries, and India included, to reset relations and to restore economic ties with India, which he says is a massive, major strategic priority as India is a growing nation. And as Canada needs to diversify on its trading portfolios away from the United States. Now, we're going to see what this means as Canada's largest exports, 70% to 75% go to the United States. 90% of Canadian oil goes to the United States. So it's going to be interesting to see how Canada is going to diversify away from the United States, but also it's interesting to see what this prime minister is working on in terms of expanding Canada's trade relationships with other nations. And so to that, you had Prime Minister Mark Carney travel to India earlier this year to meet with Prime Minister Narendra Modi to discuss trade, energy, minerals, technology, and the overall supply chain cooperations between the two nations. This reset is significant after what we saw take place in the last couple of years with the growing geopolitical fragmentation between the two countries. But this is coming at center where you see India aggressively expanding their trade agreements with the European Union, with the Nordic countries, and very strategic alliances lately with UAE as well and Israel, and now one of their biggest business delegates to Canada. So we're going to cover, what's going to take place in the next 2 days to see what the developments are between these two nations. But on the trade and energy, as it's becoming central focus, India is now the world's largest growing major economy and one of the largest future markets for energy, uranium, agriculture, AI infrastructure, and critical minerals. Now, this suggests that Canada and India are going to explore long-term energy agreements. We're going to see what comes out after these 2 days, potentially uranium supply management and arrangement, and expanded investment between the two countries. India has also reportedly expressed strong interest in Canadian LNG, potash, and agriculture and natural resource exports. So this is at a time where, this entire thing took place with foreign interference, essentially intelligence reports showing that, that this is a massive concern when it comes to foreign interference in Canada. This is something we've been hearing about when it comes to Canadian elections, what countries could be partaking in terms of the foreign interference. And so, this is a balancing act from the Prime Minister to be able to grow Canada's economy by having these trade agreements, but more specifically being able to address some of the concerns Canadians have when it comes to Canadian security and foreign intelligence. But, this is a balancing act on security and economics by the Prime Minister. As Canada wants to have stronger Indo-Pacific trade ties, we know that that's part of the massive energy push with Ottawa and Alberta to extend the pipeline over to BC and across to the Indo-Pacific, regions that need oil. And Canada is well suited to be able to provide that. And the diversified export markets that Canada desperately needs because of its relationship with the United States. And all of that is, of course, a moving story that we've been covering these past few weeks to see where things, go with the relationship with the United States. As of now, we have not heard that the conversation has started between the United States and Washington, D.C. and Ottawa. That's to be seen in the next few weeks what happens as June is quickly approaching, and we're looking at like a 5-week mark to see what this renegotiation is going to look like. Meanwhile, our Mexican counterparts have been talking to DC. They're on their second round of talks. So now we're seeing these, movement when it comes to the trade minister who needs to make sure that Canada is diversifying its trade, and Prime Minister Mark Carney aggressively working on this. And of course, day by day, as we hear more news of what comes out of this massive delegation, we'll let you know. Now, going to the next huge story that everyone's watching, the world markets are paying close attention to what's taking place when it comes to this ongoing conflict between United States and Israel with Iran and the fallout of what's taking place in southern Lebanon. So now the latest headline that has been making rounds from President Trump and Marco Rubio is essentially President Trump saying that there could be a potential potential peace agreement. They announced it's kind of before this long weekend. It is Memorial Day today in the United States. It's a holiday. And this was essentially, said on Friday, bringing down the, gas prices because it showed potentially a peace agreement. And I think potentially that was strategic as well because, when there's announcements of potentially a peace agreement between the two countries, an end of a conflict, then the markets react fairly quickly, bringing down the gas prices. But now this is happening at a time where President Trump is saying that there could be a potential peace agreement with Iran, and then he says it's not fully negotiated yet. So they're saying that there's talks. We know just last week there was a proposal sent from the United States to Iran, and then Iran went back with a few pointers. We know that Pakistan has been a mediator in all of this, but now what's significant is today is that high-level Iranian negotiators are now in Qatar, essentially looking to resolve what Tehran is calling one of the most sensitive areas in this peace agreement that they're saying is still unresolved. And while President Trump is saying that, the negotiators in Qatar should not be so quick to make a deal or any deal. And if you recall, that's what the Israeli Prime Minister was also saying to President Trump, not to go for a quick deal when it comes to Iran on their nuclear program. And now President Trump is echoing that, saying, any deal that's done essentially could reshape the Middle East, security measures when it comes to the oil markets and what it means for Iran's nuclear program. Now, you had Marco Rubio also saying that the Strait of Hormuz is going to be open, and that's to be seen in terms of, is Iran going to have authority over the Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the items that they've been asking for since the ceasefire took place on April 8th. Now, Iranian negotiators that have arrived in Qatar, essentially you have the top officials, including Mohammad Ghalibaf, who is the Speaker of the Parliament of Iran. You have the Foreign Affairs Minister Abbas Araghchi and the Central Bank Governor Abdul Nasser Hemeti, arriving in Qatar. And they're saying that they're going to focus on the sensitive parts of the negotiation, which essentially has to do with, coming between, DC and Tehran about sanctions relief, which Iran has been asking for, Strait of Hormuz being open, which is a very contentious issue for the United States, that has been asking for since the start of this conflict, and uranium enrichment and the existing enriched uranium that they have, about 60% enriched, and the Iranian foreign assets that have been frozen and sanctions removal, as well as what would be a security guarantee that this war won't erupt again when Iran meets the terms of the United States. So now you have that taking place. Meanwhile, you have Marco Rubio essentially saying that there's significant progress being made. He's saying that, this is that the conflict, it's towards the end of the conflict. If you recall early on, you had Marco Rubio saying, Secretary of State saying essentially this is only going to be a few weeks and it's going to be over. And now we're looking at, what's over 2 months period. And now we have the Secretary of State saying that this conflict is towards the end, really signaling that they're not prepared to, restart this. We know that we covered this last week as well, where there was a conversation between the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump on President Trump wanting to go for a diplomatic route in terms of coming to a peace agreement and negotiating on those sensitive items that Iran, is calling sensitive to Tehran sovereignty. But then you also had the Prime Minister of Israel saying that they should essentially relaunch combat if necessary to remove the enriched uranium and ensure that, Iran does not have a nuclear program. So that was essentially where things were at between those two world leaders. And it looked like they had, diverting views of how the next steps should be taken. But now when you have, Marco Rubio saying that the conflict is towards an end, meaning I can't imagine it would restart, but we've had all kinds of surprises so far, right? But then you also have the Iranian delegations of negotiators being extremely active, right? Taking trips to Pakistan and Russia and China and now Qatar and Oman. you're seeing that it's very strategically placed in terms of, what is going on in the region and what is happening with these relationships and how they're shifting in real time when it comes to this conflict and what could be coming next. Now, President Trump is facing a lot of pressure from both sides, right? When it comes to his base and his administration, you have the war hawks, and then you have the anti-war voices, right? The war hawks being, Marco Rubio being one of them, who is pro this conflict, this war that erupted on February 28th. Pete Hegseth, of course, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War. And then you had on the opposite side, Vice President JD Vance, who has been anti-war, right? But saying he's going to, essentially support the president in his decision. And when it comes to the Republican Party, well, you had the Republican allies and Israeli hardliners on when it comes to what this proposal should look like and whether it should escalate and trigger an ongoing war. Now, they are saying that because this peace proposal is very critical on Iran's future and the stability of the Middle East, and when it comes to the oil markets, they're saying that they don't want to repeat what they call a mistake under Obama years in the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. They're saying that, that to be very serious about Iran not becoming a nuclear nation at all. Now, you have the Americans on the other side who are anti-war and they're anti and they oppose prolonged military escalations and when what they call forever wars, which has been causing, higher inflation rates and higher fuel prices. And the higher fuel prices, about 40% that contributes to their latest inflation rate of 3.8%. And what they want out of is these, Middle East conflicts, being in Iraq, Afghanistan, what they call the forever wars. And now with what's taking place with Iran and how the fallout of that is affecting the global markets. So now President Trump appears to be trying to have this balancing diplomatic position with being able to satisfy, both sides. And as this what many called was a stalemate in the both sides not really moving forward or back in terms of forward with a peace agreement or back into a greater conflict. To that, we're seeing that potentially things could be coming to some sort of an agreement with the latest travel of Iranian negotiators to Qatar. Now, we know Pakistan has essentially emerged as the key player behind the scenes and in front of the scenes when it comes to mediating between the two countries and bringing, back and forth the peace proposal. And we know that Asim Munir was in Tehran just a few days ago before the Iranian delegates are in Qatar today. So there's a lot of moving pieces. But when it comes to Pakistan, they've been a major, played a major mediation role. When it comes to ceasefire negotiations that took place on, on the evening of April 7th, if you recall, starting the ceasefire from April 8th, diplomatic messaging between the two countries from Washington, D.C. to Tehran, and them essentially hosting the first round of talks in Islamabad and what they've been doing in terms of the back channel communication with Russia and China and Saudi Arabia and the rest of them. We know that several Gulf countries, including Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, are also heavily involved behind the scenes. And the biggest point, which has, created this stalemate on these peace talks and having an end of war proposal, and agreeing to it on both sides, is the uranium stockpiles, right? Which has become the core issue in this Iran deal. If you recall, in the first round of talks with Vice President JD Vance, he essentially said, Iran should not be allowed to enrich uranium for 20 years, right? Not even for civilian purposes. And Iran to that first said 3 to 5 years, then agreed to 12. So we know that generally that has been met. Now, what remains here is the uranium stockpile issue, which is one of the biggest obstacles in this negotiation because Iran's highly enriched uranium at 60% is the issue that Israel is also pointing out, that's saying that that should be removed, even if it means boots on the ground combat to remove the enriched uranium. American officials essentially want, under the Trump administration, Iranian stockpiles removed, diluted, or destroyed. And that would be as a part of any final peace agreement, right? And Iranian leadership has now signaled that their willingness in principle to do it, but to discuss surrendering portions of the material, although not the final mechanism, hasn't been agreed to. And also, the other issue was the U.S. asking Iran to dismantle its nuclear sites, to which Iran said no, they will not. But it looks like things are progressing in terms of this enriched uranium, the stockpiles that are in Iran. And as it's been, a central issue, because it could be very easily become weapon grade, nuclear material. And this is what, President Trump has been saying, that this is one of the major issues, and that if that's agreed on, then he can pull back the U.S. Naval base that is, against the Iranian ports, and to that, open up the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Iran has signaled that, they're going to manage the Strait of Hormuz, that they don't necessarily need the United States to give them approval to do so. And already they've, we showed you their X account, that they're saying, tune into our X account to know what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz today. And so far, the reports coming out of that area is that vessels have been able to cross without an issue. Now, have they been paying the Iranian authorities to be able to cross without an issue? That's to be seen. We know that earlier on the conflict, essentially, there was that $2 million mark that needed to be paid by countries that want their vessels to cross the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz and LNG. So it's a very critical route for especially Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Iraq, Iran. And so this is something that Iran is formalizing, but it'll be very interesting to see how the other nations who are part of the Strait of Hormuz in that Persian Gulf feel about Iran formalizing their position. Now, many critics will say that, hey, if this all comes down to the Strait of Hormuz, then why did you go into war with Iran, given that the Strait of Hormuz was open and it was under no country's authority? It was free waterway for the shipping routes for 20% of the world's energy, right? To which now I think the major sticking point is for President Trump to be able to say, well, we went into war. Yes, this conflict, took place over 2 months, and, gas prices went through the roof, inflation went up, but we got Iran to get rid of their enriched uranium. Iran is no longer a threat, and this is why we did it. So that would be what President Trump would want to push forward as a big sticking point to why, go into war with Iran, given that no one's talking about regime change anymore, given no one's talking about really anything else other than opening up the Strait of Hormuz with the contention of removing the enriched uranium. Because if you recall, with the previous Iranian regime under Ayatollah Khamenei Sr., there was a fatwa for, not having a nuclear program, essentially, and that was the case. That was a fatwa. And now, since that regime has been removed in terms of, that Ayatollah, and now you have, Ayatollah Khamenei, I guess, Junior, Moshtaba Khamenei, who no one has seen but has heard from in terms of his statements released through Iranian state media. That was the issue of knowing, like, where does actually Iran sit on this? Because when the Ayatollah changes, the fatwa, which is like a legal ruling, is then null and void, and whether the next Ayatollah carries it on or not was the main issue. So we know that Iran is going through massive inflation. They're going through a crisis of their own when it comes to their economy. The U.S. blockade of Iranian ports prevent Iran from exporting their oil. Iran is asking for reparation, for payments, right? For trillions of dollars of damages to Iran's infrastructure. And so to this, it'll be very interesting to see how, now that the United States and Iran are both saying the Strait of Hormuz is open, does that mean they've come to an agreement that Iran will keep it open and charge a toll? Right? If you recall earlier on in the conflict, President Trump said, yeah, they would be happy to collect part of that toll. So that's to be seen on how this is going to evolve. Iran is continuously saying that they reject full capitulation, saying that despite signs of diplomatic progress, saying that they will not accept a term that they find as insulting, and that would mean a total nuclear dismantlement, right? So at the same time, Iran, this regime, which, if you recall, massive protests, right, that took place for months on end in Iran to get rid of this regime. And so you had this eruption by the Iranian people prior to the war, and what looked like a massive civil revolution taking place. And then the war struck. And so at the same time, you have this regime that's trying to stay intact with a new Ayatollah that no one has seen. And, really, their foreign affairs minister making the rounds and appearing to be the voice of the negotiators, as well as the Speaker of the House. You have them pretty active, in the news and in international news and headlines. And so you take that into consideration and you think, okay, well, this regime also has to play a balancing act to say, to show the Iranian people that, okay, we're going to stay in power, we're going to protect you, we're going to do some of these things. But of course, there's also news coming out of Iran that, this regime is aggressively going after people who were protesting the regime prior to the escalations of this conflict with the United States and Israel. And so all of this is taking place at the same time with, many Iranians who are protesting even outside of Iran, really conflicted at the fact that, perhaps this regime will stay in place, but at the same time, really, feeling sorry for what has happened to Iran, what's happened to the Iranian people because of this ongoing conflict. So you have that balancing act that is not just President Trump that's doing it, but you also have it inside of Iran, with Iran pushing for, the sanctions lifting. Sanctions have been there for half a century, right? Since 79, since 1979, and releasing of the frozen assets, and a guarantee that if this agreement is done, that there wouldn't be any future military attacks. And you can understand why, because last year there was a 12-day conflict that took place, and to which there was negotiations taking place in Oman. And then you had, an agreement that was supposed to happen with the officials saying, yeah, they're close to an agreement between Tehran and DC. And then you had the conflict rising and the war starting on February 28th. And if you recall, that was when Marco Rubio came and said, Israel was going to attack anyway, and we decided to take part in that. So, a lot of things that have happened, and now it looks like things are shifting. And of course, we're going to bring you the latest on what's going to take place, what this means on the greater part. Of course, there's countries that have been highly affected, aside from inflation rates going up here in Canada and the United States, gas prices going through the roof. But then you have countries like China that rely 40% of their energy comes from the Strait of Hormuz, or countries like Japan, 65%. Of their energy comes from the Strait of Hormuz, from those GCC countries. And then you have the entire crisis with fertilizer, which UN is saying that there will be a famine crisis if this continues in African countries. So this is the latest that's taking place right now in Qatar, that we're watching very critically to see what's taking place. In 2026, what we're seeing is the conversations have essentially been changed to tariffs under President Trump, renewed negotiations when it comes to trade and strategic partnerships that we haven't seen before. A lot of movements by many different countries, like UAE leaving OPEC after 50 years, essentially determining how much production for their oil, and pricing models. We're seeing increasingly, the petrodollar being shaken because you have Iran selling oil to China in Chinese yuan currency. So a lot of different changes from the establishment, and this has all been essentially put forward by President Trump in his second term in office. And many could say, looking back, and still being in the middle of all this conflict, that maybe some changes, some of this, eruption of the status quo has been good for their government. And even though the hard times of trying to figure out, who are the new allies, how to position themselves, when you look at what's happened in Canada, it's been very significant, right? We changed prime ministers, our energy policies are changing, the carbon capture for what Ottawa had put in place, or the carbon tax, axing that. So many different changes are taking place in Canada, but at the same time, we have our contentious issues of the referendum, which are going to bring you all the latest details of what's happening in Alberta. It's been making news nonstop as one of the biggest issues right now in Canada. We're going to explain to you what that's all about after we take a break and come back.